to the Caribbean and the U.S. Virgin Islands, south into South America, north to the pole, and worldwide on the Internet. This is Coast to Coast AM. Good morning, everybody. I'm Art Bell. And in the continuing adventure into the unknown, uncharted territories of the human mind, we're going to be departing a little, in a way, this night and interviewing a very, very unusual individual on the big island of Hawaii named Terence McKenna. Who is Terence McKenna? Well, among other things, he's probably the successor to Timothy Leary. Now, that may not be the focus, or it may turn into the focus of the interview. I don't know. And I don't care. He also has a lot of very interesting views on time and what we are approaching. We'll talk about all that with Terence McKenna. Very interesting fellow in a moment. As a matter of fact, he had to come down. Oh, we'll find out about that from a very obscure location. All right, this should be most interesting. First, let us see if we can establish contact. Terence McKenna, are you there?
I am, Art. Good evening. How are you?
Well, I'm just fine, and I hope you hear me. I hear you okay.
Yes, I hear you fine.
All right, you're on the big island of Hawaii, is that right?
That's right.
Now, when I called you the other day, you were way up in an area where your only contact with the outside world was by cellular telephone. Where do you actually live? On a mountain somewhere?
I live up on the slopes of the world's largest volcano, which is Mauna Loa, and when you called me the other day, we mutually agreed my cell phone is not ready for prime time, so I came off the mountain. I do have up there a 128K connect to the internet that's wireless, 40 miles through the air.
Oh.
But my phones are not so good, so I came down off the mountain to talk to you this evening.
Well, if it were not for the delay, I would say an internet phone. We could have done the interview by internet phone, but you have that little delay there that makes it hard, so I think we've done the right thing. Anyway, so you're off your mountain perch. By the way, Terence, what's it like living on the side of an active volcano?
Well, it's very exciting, actually. I don't know if you've ever been out to the Big Island, but people think of Hawaii as swaying palms and endless beaches. What we have out here are lava fields and 14,000-foot mountains on this island, two of them. One, the world's largest volcano, the world's largest mountain in terms of volume, and the other one just 100 or so feet shorter. So we've got quite a dramatic landscape out here.
Is there any possibility that volcano will actually blow?
Well, it's been in continuous eruption for the past 13 years, but over on the other side, about 70 miles away on the what's called the Hilo, or the west side. So we sort of feel pretty safe out here. There is some talk. They had a meeting of the International Geophysical Congress a couple of years out here. There is large-scale destabilization that goes on periodically in these islands, big undersea landslides that produce local tsunamis. But in an effort to escape human-created catastrophe and confusion, I'm betting that I can eke out 50 years on this island and slide through in good shape.
Well, it's probably a pretty good bet, actually, in the long scheme of things.
I think so. I think Hawaii, if the world flies to pieces, it'll be a very good place to be, and if the world doesn't fly to pieces, it's a pretty good place to be.
And if the volcano should totally blow up, it's a painless death.
That's right. And a dramatic one.
Yeah, and a dramatic one as well. That's right. All right. You have a theory about time. Time, actually, Terence, is one of my favorite all-time topics. Before we launch into what you think about time, tell me what you think time is. In other words, is time our invention, or is time a real thing that I realize we're measuring it, but in the cosmic scheme of things, is there really time?
Yeah, you give me a perfect entree to launch into this thing. See, in the West, we have inherited from Newton what is called the idea of pure duration, which is simply that time is sort of a place where things are placed so that they don't all happen at once. In other words, it's viewed as qualityless. It's an abstraction. In fact, I think when we carry out a complete analysis of time, what we're going to discover is that, like matter, time is composed of elemental, discrete types. All matter, organic and inorganic, is composed of 104, 108 elements. There's arguments. Time, on the other hand, is thought to be this featureless, qualityless medium. But in fact, as we experience it as living, feeling creatures, time has qualities. There are times where everything seems to go right and everything seems to go wrong.
That's true. Terence, that's absolutely true. I've wondered about that all my life. There are periods of time where, in effect, you can do no wrong.
That's right.
And other periods of time where you can do no right, no matter what you do.
Well, so in looking at this, I created a vocabulary. Actually, I borrowed it from Alfred North Whitehead. But I think I'm on to something which science has missed. And it's this. It's that the universe, or a human life, or an empire, or an ecosystem, any large-scale or small-scale process can be looked upon as a kind of a dynamic struggle between two qualities, which I call habit and novelty. And I think they're pretty self-explanatory.
I'm sorry, habit and what?
Novelty.
Novelty. Okay.
Novelty. And habit is simply repetition of established pattern, conservation, folding back what has already been achieved into a system. And novelty is the chance-taking, the exploratory, the new, the never-before-seen. And these two qualities, habit and novelty, are locked in all situations in a kind of struggle. But the good news is that if you look at large scales of time, novelty is winning. And this is the point that I have been so concerned to make that I think science has overlooked. That if you look back through the history of the human race, or of life on this planet, or of the solar system and the galaxy, as you go backward in time, things become more simple, more basic.
Yes.
And so turning that on its head, we could say, as we come toward the present, things become more novel, more complex. So I've taken this to be actually a universal law affecting historical process, biological processes, and astrophysical processes. Nature produces and conserves novelty. And what I mean by that is as the universe cooled, the original cloud of electron plasma, eventually atomic systems formed. As it further cooled, molecular systems, then long-chain polymers, then non-nucleated primitive DNA-containing life, later complex life, multicellular life. And this is a principle that reaches right up to our dear selves. And notice, Art, it's working across all scales of being. This is something that is as true of human societies as it is of termite populations or populations of atoms in a chemical system. Nature conserves, prefers, novelty. And the interesting thing about an idea like this is it stands the existentialism of modern philosophy on its head. You know, what modern atheistic existentialism says is we're a cosmic accident and damn lucky to be here, and any meaning you get out of the situation, you're simply conferring. I say no. By looking deeply into the structure of nature, we can discover that novelty is what nature produces and conserves, and if that represents a universal value system, then the human world as we find it today with our technologies and our complex societies represents the greatest novelty so far achieved. And so suddenly you have a basis for an ethic. That which advances novelty is good. That which retards it is to be looked at very carefully.
Well, all right, let me stop you right there. One of the first things that you said when we got on the air this morning was that you had a 128 baud connection from your mountaintop secret location.
Right.
Okay. As we are discussing your theory, which is fascinating, of novelty, I'm taken to ask you about a quote, actually, of several pages, written by Michael Crichton, and I know you know who he is, with reference to the Internet. It is Michael Crichton's contention that the Internet, which one might consider to be novelty exemplified,
incarnate,
yeah, indeed, is going to result not in more novelty, but in fact in a slowing of the process of evolution, or novelty as you see it, because there will be a commonality. There will not be innovation. There will not be entrepreneurship. There will be 10 main ideas in America and Hong Kong and Moscow and London and so forth. How would you address that?
Well, I'm astonished. I hardly know what he's talking about. Let me give you my take on it.
Okay, let me rephrase it. He's saying the Internet will stifle diversity, and that diversity is critical to advancement.
Well, what I see happening, and I spend hours and hours a day on the Internet, is I believe it's the greatest force empowering marginal and minority points of view to come along in centuries. In other words, before the Internet, the great establishment ideas already had the machinery of media to communicate their position.
True.
What has happened is that the common man has gotten into the game with technology that I really don't think was ever intended to fall into.
Oh, you bet it wasn't.
Yes. So I don't know what Crichton is talking about. I believe what the Internet is doing is dissolving boundaries between people's idea systems, classes, and factions, and we're getting a much richer evolutionary interplay among ideas and this sort of thing. So I see it as a very fertile place with a lot of mutation going on in hardware, in how people view it, ideologies, this sort of thing. I just don't know where he's coming from with
Well, I might expand on it this way. He suggests, for example, that if you were to take an otherwise deserted or barren desert island, and you were to put a species upon it, that species, because there are so few of them, would by necessity be very innovative, would change very quickly in trying to adapt and live and stay alive. On the other hand, if you put many, many creatures on that island, that process would be far slower. And he uses that as a parallel to the Internet. I'm not sure that I agree with it either. I just found it an interesting take on the sociological implications of the Internet.
Well, you see, when people talk about the Internet, they're usually talking about the Internet that was, because it's moving so quickly. For example, I just read a paper by a guy named Alexander Cheslenko out at the Media Lab at MIT, And he's talking about plugins that will translate websites of one language into another. Well, now imagine when people can put up websites in Telugu, Witoto, Russian, French, you name it, and you can automatically slide into those websites and see what's going on.
You're describing Crichton's nightmare and your best dream, I believe.
Well, this is the thing about technology. It tends to polarize people. Let me make one point here before we leave this time thing. I said I'd identified a tendency in the universe which science had missed, which was to conserve novelty. And then you asked about the Internet, which sort of led me to the second half of the observation. Not only does the universe have this preference for novelty, but each acceleration into novelty has proceeded more quickly than the ones which preceded it. So, for instance, the slow cooling out of the universe led to the slightly more rapid appearance of organic chemistry, which led to the quite rapid evolution of higher plants and animals, which led to the hysterical pace of human history. And I see no reason to suppose that process of acceleration will ever slow down.
Is it, Terence, a linear process or an exponentially accelerating process?
It's an exponentially accelerating process, which leads to a kind of end-of-the-world scenario that has made a lot of people place me out with the squirrels, because I'm saying that this process of novelty is now moving so quickly that within our own lifetime, it is going to accelerate essentially to such an intensity that we will be experiencing more novelty in a few weeks or days than we've previously experienced in the whole life of the cosmos.
My God, you have described precisely what I have just written about. I wrote a book called The Quickening. And
someone showed me your book, and I said, this is in Atlanta. I saw it, and I said, yes, this guy is on to this.
I'm on to it from, I guess, more of a pedestrian perspective than yourself after listening to your first half hour, Terence, but we're talking about, it suddenly dawned on me precisely the same things. I've been doing this talk radio program for about 13 years, the all-night show.
Right.
And I am a trained observer of events and people. And every night I've had to watch the news and dissect what is going on in our world to prepare to do this program. And in that 13 years, unmistakably, socially, economically, politically, environmentally, you name it, we can talk about it. In every one of those areas of human endeavor, things are beginning to accelerate. There's simply no question about it. And that sounds exactly to be the same thing you're proposing here.
Yes, where I've gone further than most people is a lot of people have noticed the time is speeding up phenomenon, but they tend to give credit to science or media or something like that.
That's right.
Yes, well, what I'm saying is this is built into the laws of physics.
Oh, I think you're right. Terence, we're at the bottom of the hour. I think you're exactly right, Terence. Stay right where you are. Oh, interesting, very interesting. Terence McKenna from the Big Island of Hawaii is my guest. I'm Art Bell, and this is CBC.
97. It's Art and his guest, the late Terence McKenna. And now, enjoy this on hour on the best of Coast to Coast AM with Art Bell. From May of 1997, it's Art and his guest, the late Terence McKenna. And now, enjoy this encore presentation of Coast to Coast AM with Art Bell.
We have a very, very interesting fellow on the line. His name is Terence McKenna, and he's from the Big Island of Hawaii. And he has just described to me in language that you had to listen very carefully to, exactly what I wrote about. The quickening. And we'll pick up on that in a moment. It's fascinating. My God, it's like hearing my own theory amplified, coming back at me, or an explanation of what I wrote about. Wow. Anyway, in a moment, back to Terence. Some cases. And back now to Hawaii and Terence McKenna. Terence, I thought we lost you for a moment, but I think we have you back. Are you there?
Oh, yes.
Okay. There will be silences during the break, so do not interpret that as we have disconnected Terence. Only if you get a dial tone are we in trouble. Otherwise, just hang in there, okay?
All righty.
All right. I mean, I sat here as I listened to you the first half hour in shock because I realized you were describing exactly what I wrote about. And what I did, Terence, I realized that a lot of people say this quickening, or whatever you want to call it, whatever name you want to put to it, is a byproduct of mass communication. And I began to realize, no, it is not a product of mass communication. Yes, we're hearing about it more and more volumes of it, but in fact, what you are describing is really going on, and I documented that much in my book, in real everyday life, in each one of these areas and many more. I documented the fact that it is not mass communication that is beginning to quicken things, but there is another process at work. Now, I don't know what that is, and I don't know where it's leading. In other words, people will say, well, when we finally get to this crunch point, whatever that is, what will happen? And I don't have that answer. I'm just a talk show host, an observer. But maybe you do. When we finally reach what you call time wave zero, what is going to happen?
Well, the only way to predict what's going to happen is to look at the quality of what has happened as the quickening, as you call it, has begun to accelerate. What it's been characterized by is dissolution of boundaries between classes of people, bodies of knowledge, pools of capital, language groups, so forth and so on. And so it seems to me ultimate novelty must be a situation where all boundaries are dissolved. And of course, what that looks like, I don't know. I don't know whether it's a virtual reality where you become God through the public utilities or exactly what it is. But it's clear to me that the human nervous system is globalizing itself, building a model of conscious thought on a planetary scale. Tens of thousands of people are participating in this. None of them have a real notion what it's all about, but everyone is serving this sort of unfolding grand design. And, I think the emergence of alphabets was part of the quickening. I think the emergence of hominids out of more primitive primates was part of this quickening. I think this is the business that this planet has been about for a very, very long time.
Are you able to discern any timelines to time wave zero?
Well, yes. I mean, we've been talking about this as a metaphor. What makes me, I hope, a little different from some of the other prophets in the marketplace is I've got a formal mathematical theory that, I mentioned habit and novelty, this dualistic flow.
Yes.
Well, because it is a dualistic flow, it can be portrayed like the ebb and flow of the price of a stock or something like that. In other words, it can be portrayed as a line graph. So I've written computer programs which produce what I call novelty waves. In other words, time-scaled waves that picture the ebb and flow of novelty. And by fitting known historical and paleontological and geological data against these waves at different scales, I was able to finally discern a best fit. But the conclusion that it led to was was very startling to me, which is this ultimate novelty, this transcendental object at the end of time, isn't millennia in the future.
Mm-hmm.
It is, in fact, slated to collide with historical necessity sometime in late 2012. 2012. Now, I know you have some interest in the Mayan calendar.
I do.
I didn't know when I calculated this date that it was the same end date as the Mayan calendar, to the day.
Oh, my. Let me ask you this, Terence. What did you input to your database for this computer program? In other words,
what did I start with?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I had a very academic interest in the Qing, which is a Chinese method of divination. And this is, everyone who's looked at this thing has been struck by the fact that it seems to work. And so I carried out a mathematical analysis.
Well, wait. I don't know what Qing is, and I bet a lot of other people don't either. A Chinese method of divining. What kind of method? What is it?
Well, it's existed for thousands of years in China. It's sometimes done by throwing 50 stalks, or sometimes done with coins. But it's a method of producing a thing called a hexagram, which is made up of either broken or unbroken lines, but 6 on top of each other. So if you're a mathematician, you can figure if it's made up of broken and unbroken lines and there are 6 of them on top of each other, there must be a possibility of 64 of these things. And thousands of years ago in China, there was a vast body of literary commentary built up around these hexagrams, and they have always been presented in a traditional order, a certain way that they are always presented. And I was studying a very academic question, which is this order of these hexagrams a true order, in other words, governed by rules, or is it simply a random jumble sanctioned by tradition? And this very obscure academic question led ultimately to the discovery that the I Ching was a 384-day, 13 lunar cycle calendar. And then from there, I realized that this 384-day calendar was actually a nested subset in a fractal timekeeping scheme that was really more accurate and more sophisticated than anything in the West. So what I'm really suggesting here is that in the same way that the West conquered the nature of matter through the elaboration of modern science, about 4,000 years ago in China, a deeper analysis of time was carried out than has ever been undertaken in the West. It's quite...
Oh, Terence, what is your website?
It's at Levity. It's www.levity.com, and then just click on Terence McKenna there. Levity is Levity.
So it's www.levity.com?
Correct.
We'll get a link up shortly.
Well, I think you do. I visited your website today. You've got good people.
Yeah, Keith he does a wonderful job. All right, well, so then you get there and then just click on Terence McKenna and be sure you're buckled in from the sound of what I've heard so far.
Well, the interesting thing, you see, Art, is with a wave like that, you can do what's called retrodicting. In other words, if you have a wave of novelty that describes the past,
yes,
you have to correctly predict the Italian Renaissance, the Greek Enlightenment, the modernity of the 20th century.
Yes.
And so by predicting the past, we've gained confidence that this wave predicts the future.
That sounds quite scientific. In other words, science is repeatability, and if you can repeatedly demonstrate that you can mathematically show the events of the past, then yes, I would imagine you could project.
Well, so I've been at this since 1975, but the theory is, in a sense, very conservative. It never says what will happen. It says when interesting things are highly likely and when you're just wasting your time.
When you look out or project out toward 2012, what is the magnitude of the spike or the difference there? If you can give us an idea of magnitudes along the way.
There is only one point in the entire cycle where the level of habit drops to zero. Effectively, then novelty becomes infinite. And that point occurs on this solstice date in 2012. Now, it's very interesting. There are some people on the net called Singularis, and they're hard-headed engineering types, and they take things like rate of energy release, rate of data storage, this sort of thing, and draw all their curves out, and they conclude that sometime between 2008 and 2020, we produce infinite amounts of energy, we pack infinite amounts of data into infinitely small spaces. In other words, this same sort of thing where, because of the acceleration built into the unfolding of this novelty process, we're going to cross more territory between here and 2012 than we've crossed between the Big Bang and getting to here.
God, that's an incredible thought.
It kind of explains what's happening, you know, that it isn't the old-style religion, that it isn't the sterile, steady state of science either. It's that the universe is actually involved in some kind of process of self-metamorphosis, and human beings indicate that we have crossed some boundary into a new era, a new epoch of ever greater acceleration into this process of self-revelation. I mean, this is what religions are raving about. This is what every prophet on the street corner is trying to articulate. And
no question.
I think it's real. I think we're getting a lot of static because people can only deal with it through images that they know. You know, Marshall McLuhan once said we drive into the future using only our rearview mirror. And that's sort of what it is. But I call this thing the transcendental object at the end of time. And I think, you know, in a sense, religion, Christian revelation, it will all be fulfilled in a way none of us ever suspected, because nature has this appetite for novelty and acceleration into novelty.
And so then again I ask, at this moment that we speak of, 2012,
right?
What do you actually think will occur?
Well, I've thought about this a good deal, and they're hard and soft scenarios, but I've noticed that what the time wave seems most coherently able to track is technology. Mm-hmm. Somehow technology is very important. It's the transformation of the human relationship to the world through tools. And so what I'm thinking would fulfill this entire scenario without requiring God Almighty to put in an appearance is time travel. I think that we are moving toward, if you look at biology over huge scales of time, hundreds of millions of years, it is a kind of conquest of dimensionality.
All right, let's consider that. Somebody recently said, and I have been considering since I heard it, a very simple question. If time travel is possible, then where are the time travelers?
Well, when I asked that question to my sources, they said you can only travel as far back into the past as the moment of the invention of the first time machine, because before that there were no time machines.
That But let me think about that. Does that make sense? You could only travel back to the moment of the invention of the time machine, because prior to that, there was no capability.
It's like trying to drive where there are no roads.
Yeah.
It also means when you invent the first time machine, instantly time machines will appear by the tens of thousands, having come back through time to see the first flight into time.
That's incredible. That's a whole new line of thought for me about that question. And it might make sense. It might make sense. And your analogy is that you cannot drive, in essence,
where there are no roads.
Where there are no roads. Well, of course, you nearly do that when you go home from the broadcast here, but...
And you haven't even been up to see me. You're psychic. We're very proud of our bad roads.
I understand. It keeps the riffraff away, I suppose.
It certainly does. Actually, it doesn't keep the riffraff away, but it keeps everybody else away.
How long, Terence, have you been residing on the side of the volcano there?
Well, continuously for about 3.5 years. I've had land out here for about, since 77.
Since 77, and before that?
I grew up in western Colorado, and I had my children and my marriage and all that in California, and lived 35 years in Northern California.
You knew Timothy Leary, yes?
I knew him. We appeared in public, mostly in Europe, together a few times, and he certainly was a huge influence on me. I only came to know him in the past 7 or 8 years, but as a kid growing up in the 60s, he was an enormous influence on me.
You are now being called by many his heir apparent, his heir now, I guess.
Well, I think not by many, but I was called it by him. Everybody else kept their mouth shut. Well, I have my method. I'm very interested in the psychedelic experience. I was raised Catholic, and what I kept of that was an enormous thirst for the paranormal, the miraculous,
yes,
supernatural.
Yes.
And I went to India, and I made the rounds of the gurus and the geishas, and I didn't find what I was looking for. But when I went to South America, to the jungles down there, I discovered that LSD was only the tip of the psychedelic iceberg, and what I had taken to be modern science and modern chemistry was actually a tradition of shamanism and religious use of psychedelic plants that was thousands and thousands of years old. And that fascinated me because it worked for me. Most people who seek the mystery with...
Listen, let us pick this up after the top of the hour. Now, listen to me carefully. You've got about a 10-minute break here, at least, and you're not going to hear anything. Don't let it bother you. Just put the phone down, grab a cup of coffee or something or another, and we'll be back to you, okay?
All right.
Stay right there. This is CBC.
This hour on the best of Coast to Coast AM with Art Bell. For 97, it's Art and his guest, the late Terence McKenna. And now, enjoy this encore presentation of Coast to Coast AM with...
The lines are absolutely alive, and everybody out there, just relax for a little while. I have some advice for you. My guest is a very, very unusual person whose name is Terence McKenna. In order to properly appreciate what you're about to hear, if you're just joining us in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and so forth, you're going to have to pretty much put down whatever you're doing. I'll turn the radio up a little bit and listen very carefully, because it makes a lot of sense, but you've got to listen carefully. Terence McKenna, we'll find out more about him in a moment, lives on the side of an active volcano in Hawaii. An interesting place to choose to live by itself, and an interesting man indeed. So more of Terence McKenna coming up. Art, have you heard about Terence McKenna's theory called time wave zero? He suggests that as we get closer to time wave zero, we are experiencing tachyon radiation from it. Evidently, the impending event is so colossal that it will emit such intense radiation that some of it takes the form of faster than light speed tachyon particles or waves, which can travel faster than light, and that they're actually being hurtled backward in time. The closer we get to the event, the greater the radiation density. Hence, the more frequently and intensely we experience paranormal phenomena associated with it. We'll ask about that, by the way. We haven't yet. This could be the mechanism behind what you call the quickening. The event we are approaching will probably be something tantamount to a white hole or a mini Big Bang. It will, for all intents and purposes, be the end of time for us. Terence believes it will occur consistent with the Mayan calendar in the year 2012. Now, by the way, he has derived this independently of the Mayan calendar. He simply has discovered that it coincides with it. He goes on, it is not unreasonable to assume that ETs possessing UFOs, if they exist, will be flocking here to research, or rather pre-search, the phenomenon. It is also believed that tachyon bombardment would have bizarre effects on the human nervous system, visions, that sort of thing, as well as physical manifestations in the environment, like the Clearwater Virgin, bizarre mutations like the chupacabra, and heaven knows what else. All the stuff you attribute to the quickening might be explained by this. And after listening to the first hour, I must agree, Terence, I'm stealing one more bit of time to read you a fact that I think relates and challenges you a little bit. It is from Stephen in Wichita, and it's well thought out. Here it is. Art, I'm not sure that you can equate novelty with either acceleration or complexity. Nature has always been novel, and surprisingly so, considering earlier periods in Earth's history, given that over 90% of all species that have ever lived are now extinct, and the exotic body designs, it would seem novelty is a given. But in order to be effective, it must have a survival advantage and be passed on. Once the novelty becomes a hindrance, it disappears. Acceleration may be more a factor of population density. Virtually all of the social problems we face today have been duplicated years ago in rat population density studies. Our novel inventions of this century have simply allowed us to artificially compress distance and time by modes of travel and communications. Profit motives have directed and limited the novelty of our civilization in this century as never before, and we are becoming a hindrance. The higher the population density, the more the acceleration seems to be. Anecdotal but relative. Compare the pace of a small country town to a large city with its population density and resulting problems accelerated by stress and profit motives. That's from Steve in Wichita. What do you think, Terence?
Well, I don't disagree with all of that. I think there's certainly been ebb and flow of novelty within the 20th century, parts of it more novel than others. But I think to argue that it isn't among the most novel periods in time is a pretty uphill battle. The question is whether novelty is something which simply adheres to statistical dynamics, or whether it's a real direction, a real arrow that is directing process, and that's what I maintain. I think it's not true to say that the biota of the Earth today is not more novel than it was in the past. Certainly there are novel forms of life which have undergone extinction, but the proliferation of human life, which is an advanced animal plus a culture-creating creature, indicates to me that we're at a level of novelty that this planet has never before experienced. Of course, it's an arguable thing because history, which is what we're always comparing these waves to, is not yet a quantified thing. I mean, how do you rate the War of the Roses over Queen Anne's War or something like that? But nevertheless, though we don't have an absolute quantification of history, there is general agreement among historians that events like the Renaissance, the Greek Golden Age, the 20th century are periods where a great deal of novelty in social forms and technologies was concentrated.
All right. You put together a computer program which was able to trace the ebb and the flow of this novelty and, in effect, chart major events in history. How many, if I might ask, hits and misses when you got this in final development, and then you look at each point in history, how many hits and misses? Were there any misses in the model, or did you hit each major moment in history on the nose?
Well, by my understanding of this theory, there can be no misses. In other words, it's not a statistical theory. We're not okay if we're right 2/3 of the time.
Hear, hear.
So we have to be right all the time.
So you're telling me you are?
I submit to you and to the world for your examination and critiquing the fact that, yes, the time wave with its end point in December 21st, 2012, described with as great an accuracy as I am able to discern the actual vicissitudes of novelty and habit in history and natural history. That's the claim. That's right.
Terence, have you submitted this? I mean, this is serious science that you're discussing. Have you submitted this because of its repeatability? That's science. Now, have you submitted this to peer review?
Well, among mathematicians, yes, and there's a lively debate raging on the Internet about that. Let me say something, though, here about science and why the acceptance of the time wave can't really occur under the tent of ordinary science. You have mentioned repeatability. Repeatability is the idea at the very basis of the scientific method, at the very basis of experiment.
That's right.
It's what's called restoration of initial conditions. But now notice that what the time wave theory is saying is that every moment in time is a unique moment.
Is unique and will not specifically repeat. But what you're suggesting is that you can plot the highs of novelty throughout history.
Yes, you can, but you cannot assume that you're doing it probabilistically. In other words, essentially, when you really understand philosophically what the time wave is saying, it's an enormous attack on probability theory. You know, the way science works now is if you want to know how much energy is flowing through a wire, you take 1,000 measurements, you add them together, and you divide by 1,000, and then you have the current flowing through the wire. But notice that assumes that it doesn't matter what time you make the measurement. And so much of science is like this, to the point where I am redefining science and saying science is the study of those phenomena so coarse-grained that the time in which they occurred does not affect them. And that leaves out, then, history, love affairs, corporate takeovers, empire building. Everything interesting in the human world is too fragile, too finely embedded in the context of its time to be open to that kind of scientific modeling.
Mm-hmm. So, in other words, they're really relatively small, insignificant events that don't enter into the larger measurements you're making of this ebb and flow.
Well, for instance, on a given day when the chart says novelty will be high, certainly somewhere in the world someone is having a very unnovel day. It's a statistical thing, a bell curve, no reference to you, Art,
sure.
But a bell curve where when the wave is predicting high novelty, most people, most systems will experience that novelty, but of course some will not. It's the idea that probability is ebbing and flowing. You know, when you study statistics, the first thing they teach you is when you flip a coin, the odds are 50-50, heads or tails. If that were true, the coin would land on its edge every single time. That's the rarest of all results in a coin toss.
Indeed.
So what's really happening is that what are called secondary and tertiary factors are causing the coin to be heads or tails. I say no. There are zones in time where heads are favored and zones in time where tails are favored. The idea that time can be described as a perfectly smooth surface and then dealt with statistically is just a first pass with Greek idealism, and careful examination of nature shows it to be inadequate in the same way that perfect circles were inadequate for describing planetary motion.
You are therefore saying that conventional science does not have and cannot have, with its present course of investigation, and a proper understanding of time.
That's right, because it assumes that it is to be analyzed with statistics, and that flattens out and denies the difference among various times and types of time.
God, Terence, how long have you been working on this?
Oh, since 1971.
71?
Yes.
What is your... You told me that you're originally from Colorado, family and all that back in Colorado.
Right.
Then finally exile.
Well, essentially, yes, and I got myself to the University of California at Berkeley right at the time of the anti-war movement and all of that. It was like a kid in a cultural candy store, and studied philosophy, art history, and then went off to Asia, basically to check out the hash dens and the gurus, and the hash was fine, but the gurus just wanted into my pocket. And so then I went to South America, and as I mentioned, that's where this shamanism thing just really grabbed me.
What part of South America, Terence?
Southern Colombia, the Putumayo River Basin. And, you know, it's the psychedelic plants that are so fascinating to me, because you mentioned repeatability. Here's a technology, a technique that lets you repeatedly and with relative safety journey into alien worlds filled with alien forms of intelligence. And it's the only thing I've found that does that. In other words, I've investigated flying saucers, crop circles, this and that. It doesn't turn me on. But
no, let me quickly stop you there and ask you about crop circles. Many people feel that they are fractal in nature, and if you're on the internet, I know you've seen photographs of some of the more amazing ones, Stonehenge, some of the rest of them. They do appear to be fractal. What is your thinking there?
Well, I was thinking, you know, I don't think it's been published in this country, but this wonderful book called Around in Circles by Jim Schnabel, to my mind, that blows the lid off the whole crop circle thing. You and I could spend a whole evening, Art, discussing the relationship of the media to the human psyche, to how people handle evidence, and because I really think the psychedelic community has evidence to give on these paranormal questions that has never been properly heard and evaluated, because the ordinary society's attitude toward people who use psychedelics is that they are automatically unreliable.
Yes, I know.
But I think we're not going to crack stuff like UFO abductions and that sort of thing unless we admit the psychedelic evidence. And if we do admit it, suddenly the whole thing begins to look very, very different.
All right, Terence, I don't reject it. And a lot of guests that I've had on who have been into the very same areas we're in right now, very politically correctly rejected out of hand. You don't need it to accomplish this, they say, that you can do it within yourself. And I don't reject that thought either, but I would like to hear the case that you would present for psychedelics opening the doors that you're talking about, that in fact they do. How would you make that case?
Well, I hear what you're saying is you're equating spiritual techniques like yoga and prayer and human decency and that sort of thing. I'm not sure there's a connection. I mean, it does help to be an ethical person to take psychedelics, but for instance, the psychedelic that has fascinated me most over the years is DMT, dimethyltryptamine. Now, this is not a well-known substance.
No, it isn't. What is it?
Well, that's what it is, dimethyltryptamine. It occurs in a number of plant species throughout the world. It's utilized by native peoples. And in the pure form out of the laboratory, when you smoke this stuff, you find yourself inside the flying saucer that all these dazzled people are raving about. But you found yourself there by initiating an action on your own. In other words, repeatability. And after about 3 minutes of spending time with the self-transforming elf machines and their technologies, you're deposited back in your apartment, pretty much none the worse for wear. Well, now let's give this stuff to the leading lights of the UFO community or anyone else who has an interest in unusual psychological or paranormal phenomena.
All right. Hold tight, Terence. We're at another break point. Stay
To the open.
Terence McKenna is my guest. What a totally interesting individual he is. You've got to sit by the radio, turn the volume up a little bit, put down your book or whatever else you're doing, and listen. Back now to the big island of Hawaii and a very unusual individual named Terence McKenna. Terence, I've got a question for you. Have you ever watched Star Trek?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes, good. You're familiar, then, with the Prime Directive.
Thou shalt not interfere is, I believe, the Prime Directive.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Now, what you are saying is so serious and is such a large revelation that is it not possible that you are, in a sense, doing what you're doing right now, violating the Prime Directive?
Well, you know, it's only been about 100 years since the news began to arrive in the lap of Western civilization that there were these psychoactive plants scattered around the world. The first one was the peyote cactus, and in 1888, mescaline was extracted from that. I think it's not without implication that right at our moment of greatest cultural crisis, when we're destroying the environment and uprooting the rainforests and so forth and so on, that out of those same rainforests comes a phenomenon which, if we will face it squarely, offers a severe challenge to our notion of how reality works and how the world is put together.
And what if we miss it? What if we burn down finally enough of the rainforest that one plant that we could have used is destroyed?
Well, this may have already happened in the sense that there are many known cases of people collecting promising plants from only one known source and then returning a few months or years later to find the whole thing
gone,
paved over.
That's right. All right, tackle this one, Art. Very interesting. Terence describes a workable scenario. But my question with it is this. Is this a universal process or only a localized effect? I believe that one of the theories of modern physics describes that observations affect the process or thing being observed. Isn't it possible that the data, the random sticks in China, is somewhat skewed by what is being determined as to time? Hasn't everybody noticed the phenomenon of time being perceived to slow down depending on how frequently you, for example, look at the clock? Cooks have noticed the same effect with boiling water. The quickening may be happening because we notice certain events and then notice more of the same as time goes along. In other words, we cause the process to occur, at least from our point of view. Ed in Nashville. Is this a moment of deep thinking?
Yes, well, I am thinking. I think it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. I think we are contributing to it as we uncover it within ourselves.
Yes.
Something is calling us toward itself, and as we approach it, we become more like it. Something is sculpting out of the primate body over a couple of million years an entirely different kind of creature. And as we go to meet this thing, which I call the transcendental mystery at the end of time, we are taking on more and more of its characteristics, its godlike power, its ability to span space and time.
Yes.
And when we finally do reach it, I imagine there will be a kind of effortless moment of merging and recognition.
Signposts along the way, life on Mars, maybe Europa, cloning.
The rise of the internet, virtual reality, nanotechnology, possibly alien artifacts, all that and more. One image I carry of this thing, Art, is, you know those mirrored balls they hang in dance clubs that send scintillations racing around the walls? Well, the scintillations are distortions of the thing. And so as we approach this transcendental object at the end of time, there will be more and more breakdown of ordinary reality and more distorted scenarios of what it is.
That clearly is a process underway now.
Yes, and everyone is, through their own fears, religious training, hopes, they're trying to project, what is it? What is it? And there's a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty. I am not afraid of it. I would really like, one of the great things about the psychedelic aliens is they don't vibrate with this strange vibe that the fetal trading grays of popular media vibrate with. It's a much more upbeat and affirmative kind of alien contact that occurs through the plant.
This one plant, or this one drug that you described,
dimethyltryptamine.
DMT. I don't know what that is.
Well, what makes it so attractive in a discussion like this, Art, is it's one of the most powerful of all of the psychedelics, but it only lasts 5 minutes.
5 minutes? 5
minutes. So someone who has spent a lifetime dissing psychedelics or denying the existence of the paranormal, for that matter, should at least be willing to invest 5 minutes. We've never lost anybody. You pick yourself up and go on about your business.
5 minutes?
5 minutes.
The effects, could you describe them to much of my audience that I know can recall the effects of LSD or various mushrooms?
It's very different.
Very different, huh?
Well, LSD is a kind of psychological self-examination and strange thought processes and insights. What happens with DMT is there is the unmistakable feeling of having gone to a place. In other words, it comes on in about 15 seconds. And suddenly you're in a place. And this place is full of what I call self-dribbling, jeweled basketballs that are intelligent in some sense. They're like badly trained Rottweilers. They come bounding forward, and what they're doing in there is they're conducting some kind of a language lesson because they speak, they have a language which you can see is the only way I can explain it.
What is the source of DMT? Is it a manufactured drug?
It can be, but its source is really in nature, in plants like Psychotria viridis, Desmanthus illinoisensis. There's a whole bunch of this Latin salad. Most of these are South American plants, but every ecosystem on Earth has DMT sources in it. In fact, the human brain naturally produces DMT. Why? We don't know, but I'd say there's a strong clue. Here's a drug which causes people to see little creatures, and this same substance occurs naturally in the human brain. Now, I'm not saying that's the answer to the UFO phenomenon, but how many people have looked at this and pursued it?
Well, then let me ask this. There are many who claim to have been abducted, Terence, and if DMT is a natural occurring substance in the brain, your theory could probably be verified by measuring those who have claimed to be abducted. Would such a measurement scientifically be possible?
Well, the problem is, you recall I said it only lasts 5 minutes. So unusual amounts of it in the body are very quickly brought down to baseline. It's one of the most transient drugs in the body ever observed. So, and an interesting thing about it, Art, is when they measure its presence, they look at human cerebrospinal fluid, and they've discovered that it reaches its greatest concentration there between 3 and 4 in the morning. Well, that's when people are doing the intense REM dreaming.
Yes.
And so I think the Australian Aboriginals have this concept of the dream time.
Yes.
And I think when you put the dream time, the chemistry of DMT, the abduction stories together, and the depth with which modern media has programmed and messed with people, you're very close to being able to begin to talk about the alien phenomenon. I think there are aliens, but I think they can only reach us through our minds. They don't cross the universe in ships of titanium. They don't even project holograms of themselves into the desert air. They come through the human mind. And if you look at the human mind, in all cultures and in all times and places, except Western Europe, in a few intellectuals in the past few hundred years, the human mind has always been haunted by sprites, gnomes, mixies, elves.
Yes.
So I don't see the UFO, the modern wave, as anything more than the latest wave of this mysterious relationship we have with disembodied minds through the imagination. Well, then people say, well, so this is the old psychological reduction argument. No, because when I say the human imagination, I don't mean some paltry psychological function. I think the human imagination is the largest part of us and where we're going to spend most of the rest of human history.
Hear, hear. All right. How is such a theory greeted by the majority of people who listen to it? I mean, right now I'm getting a lot of faxes, and a lot of people are really hearing what you're saying. Even though you've got to listen very carefully, they're hearing what you're saying, Terence, and a lot of them are agreeing with you. But there's going to be a big body of very violent disagreement, too, isn't there?
Well, yes. There are some very large eggs at stake in this game. I mentioned science and the need to revive probability theory. There's a lot of vested interest in certain versions of what the UFO phenomenon is. But you see, what I bring to all of this, and speaking for the psychedelic community, what we bring to all of this is not simply another rap or another tall tale, but a method.
Oh, no, I hear that. So then would you suggest that sightings of UFOs, abduction encounters, are, if you could be there measuring a burst of DMT, you'd certainly find it at that moment?
I think you would find it. And I think you would also, another place where you would find it is at human death. I think this is very important. And
at human death?
At human death. I think as we die, we have, if we haven't had it, a DMT trip. I also think probably every night in these deep dream states, we penetrate into realms from which we can remember almost nothing.
Well, then, that would be another moment at which you should be able to measure a spike in DMT level in the brain.
Are you talking about death?
No. Yes. I'm talking about both instances you cited, REM sleep, deep REM sleep, and the moment of death.
Well, it's been confirmed in deep REM. Doing this kind of research on dying people, you have a lot of ethical questions.
I understand. But you're saying it has been confirmed? Do you know where?
In deep sleep?
No. In what institution there has been confirmation of this?
Well, at the University of Mississippi a few years ago, a team led by a guy named Christian. All those papers are in the literature, and in fact, anyone interested in this should just search DMT on the internet, and they may have never heard of it, but they will be astonished.
Well, I've never heard of it, but your chain of logic is making sense to me now. Let us talk for a second about paranormal events. As we approach time wave zero, it is your contention, I think, that paranormal events, ghosts, poltergeists, paranormal events of all manner and shape will begin to increase, which would suggest I think that DMT spikes will be increasing. Yes?
It's a way of putting it. And certainly DMT is becoming more known in society. And there's almost a fad now of locating plants in one's environment and extracting this stuff and getting enough out to actually hit the money.
Yeah, do we have laws against it yet, by the way? I guess I'd ask, huh?
Well, it's an interesting situation. Here it is a human neurotransmitter. Every single one of us has it in our body. And yes, this is among the most illegal substances.
It figures.
It figures, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Figures.
It's the catch-22. We're all holding art.
Well, the way things are going, we'll probably all be tossed in the pokey for it. We'll have little roadside stops and DMT measuring devices.
Well, I think this was Adam's fall.
You made I'm going to return to another subject for a second. You made a fascinating statement. I said, well, if there's time travel, where are the time travelers? Your answer was, they will not be here until the first time machine is invented, because you could not go back to a time prior to the invention of a machine that would enable travel. Your parallel was you can't travel where there are not roads, and there are not roads back that far in time. If time is to virtually end by 2012, Terence, where would you see the invention of time machine, a time machine, the first time machine, between now and then?
Well, I don't think it's between now and then. Actually, I think it's then.
It's then?
It's then. In other words, if what the time wave zero thing is showing is that events can be portrayed in this linear way as a line on a graph,
yes,
that suddenly in 2012, for some mysterious reason, this can no longer be done, it must be because in 2012 time ceases to be linear. And that must mean that's because a technology is created which causes time to lose its linear and serial quality. And that could only be time travel.
And you believe that at that moment, tens of thousands or millions or who knows of time travelers will suddenly show up?
Well, actually, that's my conservative model of what would happen. What's against that is, I'm sure you've heard this, the well-known grandfather paradox, which is time travel is always said to be impossible because you travel back in time and you could kill your own grandfather. How do we avoid this?
Yes.
I think we avoid it by actually what happens when the first time machine is invented is the rest of universal history happens instantly. This is the only way paradox can be kept out of the picture. So I call it the God whistle scenario.
So in other words, linearity ends at that instant.
And the rest of the history of the universe occurs in a few milliseconds. It's sort of the reverse of the Big Bang, where you get a lot of action in the first few nanoseconds of the universe's life. In this model, the universe undergoes half of its morphogenetic unfolding in the last few milliseconds of its existence.
Is that then the moment when the human race, in effect, joins those that we can temporarily now visit only with something like DMT?
Or that the human race joins those who have passed over into the great beyond, or both. That's what I think it is. I mean,
are they one and the same in your view? Or
they may be. I've thought that, these DMT creatures, what are they? And the conservative position, since we know there are human beings, is they must be some kind of human being. But what kind? And the only answer I can come up with is souls. I mean, I resisted this, but is it possible that shamans have been using plants to peer into the great beyond, and that there is a kind of ecology of souls out there? When you ask the shaman, they say, well, you weren't listening. We told you we did it with ancestor magic. Say, oh, I get it. An ancestor is actually a dead person.
Oh.
Yeah,
absolutely fascinating, Terence. Listen to me. We're at the top of the hour. Go take a 10 or 12-minute break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about souls, because I've got some recent, really incredible news about souls, and you're just the right guy to comment on that. And don't worry, folks, we will get the lines open. Terence, rest.
Okay.
All right. Terence McKenna. Terence McKenna. Wow. Is my... If, on the other hand, you have the time to sit down and really listen to what's being said, not reacting like a Neanderthal with your head hitting the table, then you're going to come away from this thinking some new thoughts. And there's value in that. Back to Terence shortly. McKenna, that should be an interesting adventure unto itself. But I want to ask you, Terence, about a little bit about souls. You mentioned souls, and so I have two questions. One is, there was a very old medical study in which a medical doctor actually endeavored to set out and prove, in days when it was politically okay to do this kind of thing, that the soul could actually be measured, that at the very instant of human death, and he went through a whole big trip. I put the medical report up on my website. The human body loses about 3/4 of an ounce, and not due to gases or anything else you might imagine in your mind, no physical cause, all of that accounted for. And he printed and published this medical study suggesting the human body actually instantly, at the instant of death, loses 3/4 of an ounce of weight. Do you have any reaction to that?
Well, looking at it through the eyes of novelty theory, I think nature is very reluctant to give up a complex ordered form once it's been achieved. I've noticed that the difference between living organisms and things like chairs and tables, the chairs and tables don't metabolize. In a sense, the soul is something which is manifest in time. It's almost as though organisms have a hyperdimension. They're objects with time folded inside of them.
Yes.
And at death, what seems to happen is this complex morphogenetic field, if you will, simply withdraws back into whatever higher dimension it came from in the first place. It's not that